Hello, and welcome to episode 80 of Trails in the Pod. I'm Colin. That's Kevin.
Colin, elections are undemocratic. We don't need them. The best way of picking political leaders is to select names out of a hat.
I agree with you because this means that anybody can do the job because we all know that anybody can do all of the jobs equally well. We're all are equal in the eyes of the gods.
You know who believed that? The ancient city-state of Athens. They thought, without being ironic or joking, that direct elections were oftentimes undemocratic, unfair to the people. So they selected many, not all, but many of their political leaders through what is called sortition. It's a bit like being selected for jury duty. You would be called up and you would administer part of the state or a judgeship or what say you for a year. And you would be expected to fulfill your democratic duty by doing this.
That's true. But they didn't do that for one particularly important job. That would be the strategos, the general, those in charge of warfare, and oftentimes in charge of foreign policy, because there they really needed the best people to be in charge.
Yes, the flute should go to the best flute player. The army should go to the best general. But it's still interesting. They didn't have an officer's promotion board or the generals, selecting the generals. They thought the best way of doing this is to be elected.
Could you imagine if we elected generals today? Like, how would you even like campaign to be a general in today's America?
In the Civil War, the Revolution, and I do believe for a number of volunteer regiments, electing the officers up to colonel was a standard procedure, not for the regular army, but when they're first being raised in the Revolution, oftentimes, and for volunteer regiments that were often raised by a single or a group of wealthy people, they'd be elected, but not the generals.
No, not the generals. They're normally appointed. Kevin, what the hell does all of this have to do with trails?
Something incredibly relevant, we both believe. Today, we'll be talking about one of the more famous, maybe one of the most famous passages of political strategy, foreign policy of ancient literature, certainly ancient Greek literature, the Melian Dialogue of Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian, writing about the conflict he served not too well in the Peloponnesian War. It's a foundational text for how states act, for realpolitik, a foreign policy, and we think it bears direct relevance to the situation Crossbell is in at the end of episode 79 when we left it with the trade conference and all of the attacks and surprise proposals by Erebonia and by Calvert. Hey, that quasi independence you have, I have some great news. Your spending on the military is going to go down so much. We're going to save you so much money.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a text that whenever I come back to it, I find something new in it, and I really enjoy like going through it line by line, especially with a group of people. The last time that we had read this together, and it was by complete accident because we had read it um, for a different purpose. I was trying to write a paper on a different dialogue, but we decided to read the Melian dialogue in Greek right around when Putin invaded Ukraine. And that was like really on the nose, kind of one to one. It was kind of shocking how relevant the dialogue was. And so for our purposes today, we're going to read through the dialogue for you all. Um, I'll be the narrator, and I'll play the part of the Melians. Kevin will play the part of the Athenians, who, even though, the Athenians, direct democracy, this is the precursor to Western liberalism. But here they're the imperialists. They are the authoritarian, terrible people. The Melians are on the side of truth and justice. And so we'll go through this. We'll take some time to take stock as we go through the dialogue, and then we'll finish by talking about how this dialogue helps us understand the position that Crossbell is in. And we're hoping that this will also give us a toolkit to talk about Crossbell through the rest of the game.
Keep in mind that an empire, small e, an imperial state, and a democracy are not mutually exclusive. Think of Calvert and what they're doing with the relationship to Crossbell.
Yeah. It's more a practice of domination over others, not quite so much being an authoritarian state or being a democratic state. Um, all right, so I'm going to read out this first part of narration because it sets the scene for the Melian dialogue, but then we should also just kind of explain what's happening because there's a lot of stuff that the text expects the readers to know that we know because we're classicists, but that our audience probably won't know. All right, I shall begin. The next summer, Alcibiades sailed with 20 ships to Argos and seized the suspected persons still left of the Lacedaemonian faction to the number of 300, whom the Athenians forthwith lodged in the neighboring islands of their empire. The Athenians also made an expedition against the Isle of Melos with 30 ships of their own, 6 Chian and 2 Lesbian vessels, 1,600 heavy infantry, 300 archers, and 20 mounted archers from Athens, and about 1,500 heavy infantry from the allies and the islanders. The Melians are a colony of Lacedaemon that would not submit to the Athenians like the other islanders, and at first remained neutral and took no part in the struggle. But afterwards, upon the Athenians using violence and plundering their territory, assumed an attitude of open hostility. Cleomedes, son of Lycomedes, and Tisias, son of Tisimachus, the generals, encamping in their territory with the above armament, before doing any harm to their land, sent envoys to negotiate. These the Melians did not bring before the people, but bade them state their object of their mission to the magistrates and the few, upon which the Athenian envoys spoke as follows. So before we get into the dialogue proper, Kevin, why don't you summarize the context around this dialogue? What did Thucydides just tell us?
So this is in the middle of the Peloponnesian War.
Hmm.
The Athenians are bringing to bear a force against the previously neutral island of Melos, but one that they believe is inclined. Is it through politics? Is it through geography? Or something else to side with their enemy, Sparta or Lacedaemon, the Lacedaemonian League? It's a colony of Sparta. So we see that there's this idea that Thucydides is taking for granted here that like goes to like. Sparta, Spartans, Lacedaemonians settled the island of Melos, and so this a natural connection. It's not, it's grounded on a very different set of foreign policy principles than the rest of the dialogue that we will be showing, reading aloud, dissecting, and discussing, which is more about principles and hard truths about how they think, how the Athenians think the world works. This is a more patron client, I guess you could say, way of looking at relations, parental child. What do the Melians, what would they get out of an alliance with Lacedaemon, with Sparta? How would it benefit their interest? What does Thucydides say in this paragraph? It's nothing.
Well, I mean, also we should point out is that there may be the expectation that Sparta and Milos remain allies, but the Melians are not allies with Sparta. They say that they
No.
remain neutral, and it's only after the Athenians started plundering their territory that the Melians took an attitude of hostility towards Athens.
And what is Athens doing with this? It's not just their own ships. They have ships from Chios, ships from Lesbos, island close to modern day Turkey, ancient Anatolia. So it's an imperial expedition to add to the Athenian Empire.
Yes, they're trying to conquer this island, whether by diplomacy or by force.
It's an island. Most islands submitted to Athens who had a pro Athenian neutrality. This one is one of the rare islands that did not do that. As Thucydides said, they are a colony of Lacedaemon that would not submit to the Athenians like the other islanders.
And also, just to be 100% clear, because I think that we've assumed it, but I don't think we've officially stated it. Sparta and Lacedaemon are the same thing. Lacedaemon is just another name for Sparta. So if you're thinking about Athens and Sparta, Athens and Lacedaemon, it's the same thing.
Indeed. So the Athenian envoys spoke as follows. What did they say? Since the negotiations are not to go on before the people, in order that we may not be able to speak straight on without interruption, and deceive the ears of the multitude by seductive arguments which would pass without refutation, for we know that this is the meaning of our being brought before the few. What if you who sit here were to pursue a method more cautious still? Make no set speech yourselves, but take us up at whatever you do not like, and settle that before going any further. And first tell us if this proposition of ours suits you. What's going on here? This is a lot of language. What's being stated? What's being assumed? What does all this kind of flowery language
Mhm.
mean?
Yeah, so normally when diplomacy happens in the text of Thucydides, uh, the two sides will give speeches in front of the people of a given city or in front of a given situation. So normally what you would expect is something called a paired speech, in which one side gives like a full um, account of what they think, and then there will be a counter speech that gives a full account of what the other side thinks. What the Athenians are stating, and the Melians start this by bringing the Athenians not in front of the people, but behind closed doors, is that okay, we're going to have a discussion, not in front of the people, so that they don't get caught up in the rhetoric or anything like that. This is just going to be us talking about policy. And instead of having speeches, I'm going to say something, and then if you don't agree with it, you stop me, and then we're going to hash it out. It's far more dialogic, thus the term Melian dialogue, than how Thucydides is presenting a lot of other diplomacy elsewhere in the text.
And Colin, I have a confession to make.
Okay?
So, one of the more famous speeches of foreign policy in Thucydides, besides this, is the Mytilenean debate,
Yes.
a public debate among the Athenian citizens about what to do with the recently revolted colony, um, ally, subject of Mytilene. That's a debate with Athenian politicians, with the people voting. And Colin, for the longest time, even into grad school, a tiny bit, I thought this and the Melian dialogue were the same.
I just want to reiterate that that's going to go out in public, unless you want me to recant that. Um, they are similar in that they are. Not that I've ever thought that they were the same thing, but they do deal with similar issues of like expediency, realpolitik. So I could see why you might get them confused. Is there anything else you want to talk about before we move on to what the Melians say?
No, what does Milos say? The few, not the many.
Yes, the Melian commissioners answered, to the fairness of quietly instructing each other as you propose, there is nothing to object. But your military preparations are too far advanced to agree with what you say, as we see you are come to be judges in your own cause, and that all we can reasonably expect from this negotiation is war, if we prove to have right on our side and refuse to submit, and in the contrary case, slavery. So, Kevin, what are the Melians saying here?
The Athenians are judges in their own case. They have the power to decide the course of action here. It's not fair. It's not an independent third party, a neutral third party to arbitrate. It's the ones coming with an army, with a navy to decide on the rightness of what follows. They come for bear. They come with the very implicit, almost explicit expectation they'll have to fight.
Yes. I mean, it's a little bit rich from the Athenians. You know, you park an army in front of the city of Milos, and they're like, "Hey, come on, let's discuss, let's negotiate." And, you know, it when we read this, it was just like how Putin had troops on the border of Ukraine saying, "Eh, we're not going to do anything with them. You know, let's discuss. We need a dialogue." It's this kind of threatening of, at the end of the day, the Athenians are the ones that have the power here. And the Melians point out that like there's only two real conclusions to this dialogue. It's either us going to fight, or we're going to lose, and then we'll be enslaved by you.
So the Athenians say to this: if you have met to reason without presentiments of the future, or for anything else than to consult for the safety of your state upon the facts that you see before you, we will give over. Otherwise, we will go on.
And then the Melians replied to that because the Athenians are basically saying like, look, we should be talking about the safety of your state upon what's going on. Um, if you don't want to talk about that, we'll stop talking, otherwise we're going to go on. And the Melians say, it is natural and excusable for men in our position to turn more ways than one, both in thought and utterance. However, the question in this conference is, as you say, the safety of our country. And the discussion, if you please, can proceed in the way which you propose. So they are saying, all right, let us talk about the security of the city of Milos.
For ourselves, we shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Mede, that is Persia, or now attacking you because of wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech which would not be believed. And in return, we hope that you, instead of thinking to influence us by saying that you did not join the Spartans, although they are colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, you will aim at what is feasible, holding in view the real sentiments of us both, since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is the entire dialogue in a nutshell. Athens will not talk about the right they have from history, from liberating Greece, from making sure that Greece stayed free by beating Persia. They won't make speeches about that. Milos, and then they trust in turn that Milos won't talk about their history as colony of Sparta. They want to talk about what's feasible, what's best, the real sentiments, that right, that justice, that's only between equals in power. Otherwise, it's a dog eat dog world. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, is one of the most famous pronouncements of Thucydides of ancient literature.
What I find interesting about the Athenians here as well is that it's not just like, oh, we're not going to be talking about the past or how we're owed conquering you. They kind of already admit that the Melians have done the Athenians nothing wrong. But they're still going to attack. And they're like, look, we're here. Get used to it. We're going to talk about what we're doing now that we're on your doorstep and we're planning to attack. And you have to just accept that. Because, as it states at the end, the Athenians are stronger, and justice, equality, that is not part of the conversation here. Whereas the Athenians are more about what should you, as a weak state, do in light of our strong state aggression.
Might makes right. And I want to, in brief, sidebar to Crossbell quickly and
Sure.
how this relates, but also does not relate in some key areas, if you will, Colin.
Yeah.
Let's connect this to the trade conference and think back to the rhetoric used by Calvert and Erebonia. It is not, I would say, this naked about might making right, how they're stronger and they can do it. They still, in this public setting, that's not speeches, but a public setting with Erebonia, Calvert, Crossbell, but also Remophilia, liberal, they do talk about right and justice and what's best. I wonder if it was just the three states, Crossbell, Erebonia, Calvert, would we see more realpolitik language and discourse? Or would it still be couched in terms of elevated what's best for everyone, what Crossbell
Mhm.
will prosper under? What do you think?
Well, Gilead Osborne is talking realpolitik when he talks to the SSS in private, right? That is behind
Yes.
the closed doors. The trade conference itself is not behind closed doors. I mean, even if you were to just say, okay, this is um, high affairs of state, we have to keep in mind that there are observers there, there's the press there. This is a public meeting. And so it's a completely different situation than what we find with the Athenians and the Melians, because here the Athenians and the Melians are speaking closed doors. They are explicitly allowing themselves the frankness of speech. I think for Osborne and Rocksmith, while they clearly have um, the desire to dominate Crossbell, and this comes through, they do feel the need to perform a more moralistic way because they're not just speaking to Crossbell. In a way, they're not speaking to Crossbell at all because they're not asking Crossbell to respond to anything. They are speaking to the wider community of nations.
And making pronouncements. You could easily imagine those many of those same statements, slight modifications, in a press conference with Locksmith, with Osborne, and no one else.
Yeah. So the Melians, they replied to the Athenians. They're in a subordinate position. They've just been told the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And they say, as we think, at any rate, it is expedient, we speak as we are obliged, since you enjoin us to let right alone and talk only of our interest, that you should not destroy what is our common protection, which is the privilege of being allowed in danger to invoke what is fair and right, and even to profit by arguments not strictly valid if they can be got to pass current. And you are as much interested in this as any, as your fall would be a signal for the heaviest vengeance and an example for the world to meditate upon. And I think this is really interesting, Kevin. Because what the Melians are arguing is that fine, we understand the situation, but fairness and justice still has a role to play in a world devoid of justice because these concepts they play a role in governing affairs. Um, they're pointing out that in their situation, they're only able to invoke concepts of fairness and rightness. But the Athenians, if they fell, right, if their empire broke apart, and the people that they had oppressed rose up against them, uh, their only defense would be to invoke what is fair and right. And so they're urging the Athenians to kind of respect these underlying principles of international relations, even when their current level of power allows them to ignore it, because in the long run, keeping these common concepts is important for the international world as a whole.
And then let's dissect that a bit. So, on a personal level, why showing grace and mercy and justice insofar as it's part of our daily routines and behaviors, well, that's good. Everyone stumbles. And do you want a helping hand back up or the back? Friends and so forth. For states, is it can states have a friend? Or is there always going to be some self-interest in international relations? Milos talks about why it's good, why their small state rhetoric using justice is good, even if Athens doesn't believe it. And let's compare this to Crossbell. The language Crossbell uses is very much about the rights of small state, their independence, justice. Is it would they be better off talking about the horrid benefits of a neutral ground, of allowing, open espionage or whatever between Erebonia and Calvert? Or if they adopted the position the Melians have here, would that be better?
I don't know if we have an answer to that, but what I do think, to piggyback off of your point about how it's Crossbell is the small state that's bringing up concepts of fairness and justice, which Dieter does a bit, and so does McDowell. But we also have Remifaria and Liberal doing it too, right? Uh, and Liberal doing it in an interesting way, both including Chloe is both including liberal in the conversation as a third party that's supposed to oversee Crossbell, right? Let us observe, as we had discussed last week, but also by bringing in these concept of fairness. This is the defense of the small state. And liberal needs to do that because in a realpolitik scenario, they would fail. I mean, they did beat Erebonia in warfare, but that was a defensive war with a technological edge that, you know, a repeat of that, or a war against both Calvard and Erebonia would probably have a different result, or at least has the potential to. But also, Liberal's entire um, prominence on the diplomatic world stage is dependent upon the international acceptance of abstract concepts like this, as seen in their shepherding of the non-aggression pact, right? That entire pact is supposed to enshrine the values of nonviolence and diplomacy into a mutual agreement of the entirety of the continent. And so they have to argue for these principles of fairness and justice, much as the Melians are doing here, because without it, the small state, like a Liberal, like a Crossbell, like a Remifaria, has no ability to really push for what they want, to push for their own positions on the world stage.
Yeah, yeah. And that contour, that thread is picked up by the Athenians.
Yeah,
The end of our empire, if end it should, does not frighten us. A rival empire like Sparta, even Spartans was our real antagonist, is not so terrible to the vanquished as subjects who by themselves attack and overpower their rulers. This, however, is a risk that we are content to take. We will now proceed to show you that we are come here in the interest of our empire, and that we shall say what we are now going to say for the preservation of your country, as we would exercise that empire over you without trouble, and to see you preserved for the good of us both. This is fascinating by Athens. The collapse of the imperial state doesn't concern them, and even if it does happen, it's much better to be defeated and overthrown by rival imperial power like Sparta. I can't imagine Osborne saying anything like this.
I don't know if Osborne really sees it as a possibility that he would be overthrown by his
You
subjects.
know,
I mean, to the point where, like, is the other difference is that right now the Athenians are not faced with an action of open rebellion. They had been before, like with the Mytilene debate, as we had talked about, but at this point in the war, they've managed to keep a hold down on their subjects. Osborne is well aware that during the trade conference there will be a terrorist attack. And he has put, and he's cooperating with the rival empire. He's cooperating with Calvert because they both face this kind of internal revolution. The two imperial powers cooperate with each other in the ground of Crossbell to push back their oppressed subjects, quote unquote, that are trying to fight against them. So the situation here is a bit different with the Athenians because they state that they are not as afraid of being conquered by Lacedaemon as they are by their subjects who are trying to attack themselves and overpower their rulers. They see this as a risk that they're willing to make, but they're still going to be on top. Osborne might recognize his the terrorists as a threat in the abstract sense, but he, unlike the Athenians here, has taken measures to keep them down.
I have a question for you. I don't know if this is stated in the text or not. Calvard and Erebonia are plagued by, respectively, xenophobic elements and nobles who are resisting Osborne's reforms and centralization of power.
Yeah.
Are we meant to equate the two in strength? Just without knowing that much more, it seems Osborne's problems are more powerful, impactful, that the noble faction just seems a more of a power block against him than the president Rocksmith's in Calvard.
I think that's a good question. I don't know if it's possible to answer. Um, what we do know, at least from the Crossbell games, and I'm pulling a little bit on my knowledge of Cold Steel and on the Calvert games, is that if you think about it, both sides have opposition officially, and opposition in the underground. So the terrorists, the xenophobic terrorists from Calvert, there are also people in the Calvardian parliament or democratic body that are pushing for, anti-Eastern policies. That's part of what being a democracy is that you have this pluralism of voices, and people are aware of that. Similarly, with Erebonia, you have this movement to rebel. At the point of this, a civil war has not broken out yet, even though it seems to be on people's mind that this could happen. Um, but we also have nobles that are clearly against the chancellor. Like, so we've made jokes about Duke Cayenne, but he's a duke, he's a noble lord. Nobles have influence and the ability to speak in an empire. The only thing that we haven't seen with Calvert that we do see in Erebonia is that the anti-imperial, anti-Osborne terrorists that we fight explicitly state that they have friends in high places. So we're supposed to draw, I think it's explicitly drawn the link between Duke Cayenne and the terrorist. And also the fact that a car, like a vehicle comes in after you fight the terrorists, kind of shows that they have a little bit of a hand in Crossbell as well. You kind of wonder if some of the support that the terrorists have come from pro-imperial members of the Crossbell Diet that have links to Duke Cayenne. That's verging on speculation, but the element is there. Because we didn't fight the Calvardian terrorists, we don't get quite the same view as to how they are organized in Calvard, just because we see them less. And I don't remember if Kuro talks about it as much because it's later on in the timeline by the time you get to Kuro no Kiseki. Um, does that answer your question?
Does. And I would be very interested in knowing, I don't think we ever will, for the Imperial faction in the Diet of Crossbell, what proportion, how many are, quote, loyal to Osborne, and how many to Cayenne, and how many, if any, to Olivier's anti-Cayenne, anti-Osborne.
I agree that would be interesting to know. Shall we continue with the dialogue?
Yes, indeed.
So the Melians reply to the Athenians, who basically state, we're going to show you why it's best for us to conquer you. The Athenians tell the Melians how they're going to argue and to show them that it's in Athens' best interest to attack Milos, and therefore, in the Melians' best interest is to figure out how they're going to preserve their city in the face of invasion. And the Melians state, and how, pray, could it turn out as good for us to serve as for you to rule?
Because you would have the advantage of submitting before suffering the worst, and we should gain by not destroying you.
So that you would not consent to us being neutral, friends instead of enemies, but allies of neither side?
No. For your hostility cannot so much hurt us as your friendship would be an argument to our subjects of our weakness, and your enmity of our power.
Is that your subjects' idea of equity? To put those who have nothing to do with you in the same category with peoples who are, that are most of them your own colonists and some conquered rebels?
As far as right goes, they think one has as much of it as the other, and that if any maintain their independence, it is because they are strong, and that if we do not molest them, it is because we are afraid. So that besides extending our empire, we should gain in security by your subjection. The fact that you are islanders and weaker than others, rendering it all the more important that you should not succeed in baffling the masters of the sea.
I think we both wanted to pause to explain, so why don't you go ahead and explain?
Milos and Athens are going into the weeds of it. How do they gain? By submitting. How do they gain? By ruling. It's not. right? It's not justice, whatever. They are taking Milos for the moment is taking the a priori, taking as a foundational premise. Let's talk about strong and weak. How would they gain by doing this? How would Athens gain? Why wouldn't they gain by being neutral? So they're accepting the terms of debate. And that's by itself, that's a victory for Athens that this is how they're talking in detail. It's a quick back and forth, being engaged with one another. This is a victory for Athens.
I think the other thing that's important here is the principle that the Athenians are pushing forward. It's not just we're going to gain by conquering you. It's rather they feel the need to conquer Milos, or rather, they cannot tolerate the neutrality of Milos, not for Milos itself. They don't necessarily care about Milos qua Milos. What they care about is the message that they are sending to other polities under their control. Meaning that, okay, if the Athenians are not fighting Milos, then this indicates that they are weak, and perhaps that another one of their island subjects will see this as an opportunity to rebel. It's this argument of projecting power on the world stage, and the Athenians see the need to do this by asserting themselves um, on a weaker state. And I think that this is important for Osborne. There's a couple of lines of dialogue in Crossbell. I'm not sure how much that you have picked up on it. It came up a bit in the third as well, but there are polities in the north, Northumbria, Jurai, things like this, that Osborne has also been expanding towards. Crossbell is not necessarily unique in being targeted by Osborne for expansion. And I think that here, Osborne making a play at Crossbell is not important just for Crossbell, but it's also for cementing Erebonia's image of strength vis-a-vis the other states that Osborne has designs on.
It's a bit like the domino theory. They can't show weakness or let Crossbow fall here because that would have a cascading impact on the other imperial possessions, the quasi colonies, what say you, across Western Zemuria.
Yeah, it's kind of similar as well, and this is in a, I guess, a more positive light. But if you listen to American political discourse, sometimes you'll hear the argument that America needs to support Ukraine because China is watching. And if we don't support Ukraine here, then they might make the calculation that we wouldn't support Taiwan. It's the same impulse of doing something on the world stage in one place in order to communicate a message about the strength of a country in another place.
Yes, this argument can be made for, I mean, you can use this argument to have no concessions whatsoever and endless expansion of imperial rule beyond any set of frontiers that you care to name. This can be the description for essentially an absolutist, non-conciliatory, ever-expanding power. What do we have any sense? Where does Osborne want to stop? He tried to invade Liberal. He failed. He has an interest in Crossbell that precedes him, yes, but he's intensifying it. We see, we seem to see he's intensifying or advancing Erebonia into these other states that you just named. Does he want to take over Western Zemuria or what?
I don't believe that the games give us enough evidence to speculate on that point at this time.
Though he was in power, I believe, or was he not in the Hundred Day War 10
He
years
was
ago?
not in power during the Hundred-Day War.
Okay. Okay.
He was in power during the Liberal incident. That's when we first hear about him.
Yes. So I wonder who was the impetus for the Hundred Days War? Was it the Emperor? Was there another chancellor from the noble faction? Maybe Cayenne, maybe someone else before Osborne? I don't think we know. I'd be quite interested.
This is a phenomenon that I cannot discuss. So let's see how the Melians respond to the Athenians' argument that they must appear strong by conquering the Melians in order to kind of cow their own subjects into submission. And the Melians reply, "But do you consider that there is no security in the policy which we indicate? For here again, if you debar us from talking about justice and invite us to obey your interest, we also must explain ours and try to persuade you if the two happen to coincide. How can you avoid making enemies of all existing neutrals who shall look at case from it that one day or another you will attack them? And what is this but to make greater the enemies that you have already and to force others to become so who would otherwise have never thought of it?" In other words, Kevin, the Melians are saying, all right, we see where you're coming from, but we're neutral right now. We pose no threat to you, and there are other neutral parties out there watching this case. And if you take over us, don't you think that you're just going to push the other neutral powers into the arms of your enemy, seeing how you um, don't respect neutrality and try to get your way anyway?
If I was liberal, Remophilia, even the Lehman state, maybe even Arteria, I would look at what Erebonia and Calvert are doing to Crossbell and be very concerned. They know that guarantees, treaties, agreements, they don't have much power. There's treaties regulating Crossbell with for assurance, for protection, non-interference, and Osborne and Rocksmith are saying they don't matter. None of the second and third rate powers should look at the Crossbell Conference and feel anything but apprehension at Calvard and at Erebonia. This, I think, what the Melians say here is very true. It's a self perpetuating set of expanding enemies created by actions taken to reduce the number of enemies.
I agree that the Melian argument is interesting in terms of considering diplomacy as a whole, but I disagree with you that it can be so easily applied to the Erebonia Calvert situation. And the reason why is that the context the Melians are in right now is an open, hot war between the Athenians on the one side and the Spartans on the other side. So they're arguing that if the Athenians come in and attack neutral powers, then these neutral states will then be driven into the arms of the Spartans because in opposition to the Athenians, it gives the Spartans an opportunity to peacefully expand their influence with people who otherwise wouldn't have been driven to the Spartans in the first place. But because Osborne and Rocksmith are actually cooperating at the peace conference, that neutralizes this argument because where is Liberal and Remiferia and Arteria going to go? They can't look at Osborne trying to push Crossbell around and then start to align themselves with Calvert as a way to counterbalance Erebonia because Calvert's doing the same thing. In my opinion,
But
let me just finish. In my opinion, the fact that Osborne and Calvert are cooperating with this is a neutralization of the Melian argument here, and I kind of wonder if Falcom had this aspect of the Melian dialogue in mind when crafting the scenario.
can I offer a potential counter?
Sure.
There's peripheral states that Erebonia borders, but Calvert does not, and vice versa. And for liberal, I believe that most of the country borders Erebonia, a small portion Calvert, but it's mostly Erebonia. So if I'm liberal, I would be more comfortable cozying up to Calvert, knowing I'm more peripheral to them, but more central to the interest of Erebonia. And if I'm one of the like Northumbria or whatever, where Erebonia surrounds me, I'd feel very comfortable cozying up to Calvert.
Yeah, I don't think your argument makes any sense.
What do you mean?
Because, okay, most of Liberal's border is on Erebonia rather than Calvert. I don't think that matters much because Liberal borders both. They've had wars with Erebonia before, and it's not like Calvard was the best ally there, right? Part of the reason why Liberl had to develop the technology of the airship is because Calvert did not honor their alliance with Liberl during the Hundred Days War. I don't think that Liberl seeing Erebonia and Calvert cooperate against Crossbell is going to drive Liberl into the arms of Calvert. That doesn't make any sense.
Maybe not liberal, but if I'm saying Northumbria, my take from Crossbell was they tried to please two masters, they ended up pleasing none. So if I want to secure autonomy or independence against Erebonia, I would really cozy up to Calvard. Calvard benefits from having Northumbria or the others set against Erebonia than being absorbed into Erebonia. And Erebonia benefits from, say, the Lehman state being, independent against Calvard than being absorbed into Calvard, though I don't know if there's any active movements to expand
But
there.
Kevin, I think that the scenario that you're positing is dependent upon an active state of hostility between Erebonia and Calvard, which I'm pointing out in the Calvard in the Crossbell Trade Conference is not there. They're showing an active means of cooperation against Crossbell. And so I don't think Northumbria can look at that and say, oh, well, then I'm going to cozy up to Calvert because that doesn't make any sense. Calvert has shown that they are willing to cooperate with Erebonia in the domination of small states.
That are near to them. I think the takeaway, one of the potential takeaways from the cross-spell situation, they didn't have a patron who was willing to go to bat for them, who wouldn't benefit from their state situation being removed. If I'm like, just Northumbria, one of the others, I'm not in danger of having Calvard and Erebonia agreeing together to divvy me up and putting me, the me out of the way, them making an agreement above my head. But say if I'm Calvard, one of the things I'm regretting now, if I'm the mayor, is I don't have a very active third party patron or someone who can help me stand up to the two imperial powers. Calvard does not have an interest in Ambria. Erebone does not have an interest, cannot annex
Well,
Lehman state
but I
or
think that you
whatever.
just bring up the fatal flaw to your argument. Calvert does not have an interest in Northumbria whatsoever. So
They don't
why,
have an interest in subjugating Northumbria.
yeah, so why would they care about what Ereboni does to Northumbria? Right now, right now they benefit from this kind of détente between Erebonia and Calvert in their cooperation of dominating Crossbell. Why would they fuck that up by trying to help Northumbria, of which they don't have any interest in?
They don't have an interest in subjugating. They cannot annex Northumbria. After the Crossbell situation is resolved, say it becomes a powerless, even more powerless puppet. We've heard that Arabella and Calvert have tensions,
Yes,
which is
they, for example,
unsurprising. It's natural.
I mean, I do think it's important, and you bring this up, that there are other areas in which they are competing, right? So Olivier brings up the Nord Highlands, which is a part of territory that's contested between Erebonia and Calvard. That's just to the north of Crossbell. So there is that active arena of conflict. But I still don't see how this has anything to do with what a state like Northumbria, what their calculation. I don't think what you're saying makes sense.
It makes an incredible amount of sense.
No, it doesn't.
If Arebonia turns its sights on one of the states to its, north or west, peripheral states, wants to absorb it, and if they're able to do so, they'll get stronger. If
Kevin, what
I'm
you're
Calvert, if
saying,
I'm the
we need
president,
Kevin, we need to move on. But the core of your argument is that a state like Northumbria can look at the Crossbelt Trade Conference and say, "Oh, I need to cozy up to Calvert," and they're taking that lesson away from watching Erebonia and Calvert divvy up Crossbelt. It doesn't make sense.
it makes total sense. And let me explain it in full. Crossbell was harmed because it's directly between two imperial powers who, though competing, would benefit from divvying up the spoils, so to speak. Calvert and Erebonia benefit from this proposed plan for Crossbell. If Erebonia does the same to Ambria, or if Calvert does the same to Lehman State or whatever, only one benefits. Is a more of an imbalance. If I'm either Calvert or Erebonia, I don't want that to happen. So I would encourage and be encouraged by attempts by Lehman or Ambria or whatever to be to have them be a potential or real thorn. Think of it as the U.S. supporting, um, say, the Soviet Union supporting Cuba, and the U.S. in turn supporting, I don't know, Finland if we did that or whatever. Having the Cuba be a thorn inside of the U.S. benefits the Soviet Union. They can't, annex Cuba. Having some Eastern Bloc country be, say, Yugoslavia, supporting Yugoslavia against the Soviet Union helps. U.S. can't directly, subjugate Yugoslavia. Whereas where the imperial powers did benefit in, say, divvying up for a time, Germany. It was both in their best interest. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, I think that argument's a bit stronger, especially bringing in the contemporary cooperation and conflict that we see with the Soviet Union. I'm not sure if Germany is the best case because after a while, like the Germany is, I don't think is a good comparison to Crossbelt because with Crossbelt they have autonomy and you have two powers having sphere of influences, whereas by the time you get to the height of the Cold War, West Germany is its own country in the Western sphere of influence, and East Germany is in effect its own country in the Soviet sphere. And unification comes much later. But the competition between the USSR and the US divides that state in two. It's not like they're cooperating over Germany. Um, Whereas with the Crossbell case, are seeing a case in which Ereboni and Calvert are cooperating in the subjugation of Crossbell, which what I'm stating is that this gives no hope for Northumbria to think, oh, let me go curry favor with Calvert as a counterbalance to Erebonia. I agree that in a spot of hot conflict between the two, that might make some sense. And there are some elements of that in the current tensions over the Nord Highlands, but I don't think that Northumbria is in the position of looking towards Calvert as a patron in their fight against Erebonia. I'm going to give you last word, and then we need to move on.
I see what you're saying, and I do think my intention would be better supported if Calvert had helped the Liberal in the Hundred-Day War, shown its mettle and its trustworthiness as a partner. And let's move on.
Okay, so what do the Athenians say to the Melians who point out that you're just going to drive neutrals into the arms of the Spartans?
Well, the fact is that Continentals generally give us but little alarm. The liberty which they enjoy will long prevent their taking precautions against us. Rather, islanders like yourselves, outside our empire and subjects smarting under the yoke, who would be the most likely to take a rash step and lead themselves and us into obvious danger.
So we need to unpack that a bit because this is more contingent upon the historical situation that the Athenians find themselves in vis-a-vis Sparta. Why are they not concerned about people on the mainland and they're mostly concerned about islanders?
So Athens is not concerned about the continental powers, the city-states on mainland Greece, because they're not a continental power. They have a smaller army compared to the navy. Athens' navy, Athens' empire, Athens' trade, even Athens feeding itself depends on the sea. They are very concerned about the islanders, about ports, shipping lanes, and about potential neutral island city states or island city states already in the empire If they were to act against Athens, that would be much more concerning, much more potentially troubling to Athens' empire. And so that's why they're so much more proactive and even repressive.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to point out that command of the seas is integral to the Athenians' ability to survive the war. We should note that it doesn't seem like the Athenians have much of an ability um, to end the war. So the situation is like this, and Kevin's alluded to it as well. The Athenians are strong on the seas. The Spartans are strong on land. Um, I don't believe that Sparta is on the sea itself, like the city of Lacedaemon is not a
No,
coastal
no,
city, which means that in order to conquer it, in order to defeat it, you'd have to do a land siege, which the Athenians are not really capable of doing. I mean, they have a decent army, but it is not. The Spartans are renowned for their fighting ability on land for a reason, right? The Athenians know that they're not going to be able to beat the Spartans on pitched combat. But what they are able to do is prevent the Spartans from defeating them if they have control of the seas. And the reason for this is that they have a port called the Piraeus that is tied to the city of Athens by a set of long walls. And so long as Athens has control of the seas, they can import grain from all over the place, predominantly from modern day Ukraine, which will allow the city to feed itself. This is really important, especially for the early years of the war when the Spartans are besieging Athens, and Athens is able to survive even though their fields are being destroyed precisely through that mechanism. So the Athenians are pointing out that we need to maintain control of the seas to survive. What neutrals on the continent, in Asia Minor, in the Peloponnesus, uh, in the Hellenic Peninsula, Aegean Peninsula, that doesn't matter to us nearly as much.
not at all.
So the Melians reply, well then, if you risk so much to retain your empire and your subjects to get rid of it, it were surely great business and cowardice in us, who are still free, not to try everything that can be tried before submitting to your yoke. In other words, if this is so important to you, we would be terrible people if we didn't fight to maintain our independence.
And that if you, from what you say, being a subject of Athens as an islander sounds awful, why wouldn't we do everything we can to not be that way?
Yeah,
And Athens' reply is, not if you are well advised, the contest not being an equal one, with honor as the prize and shame as the penalty, but instead a question of self-preservation and of not resisting those who are far stronger than you. So it's not a contest where if you win, you get praise, and if you lose, you look bad. It's a question of survival, and subjugation is essentially better than death.
right. And then they're, calculating that is not a question of if you win or if you lose. It's a question of how you're going to lose. So pick the one that is least harmful. But the Melians counter that point, and they say, but we know that the fortune of war is sometimes more impartial than the disproportion of numbers might lead one to suppose. To submit is to give ourselves over to despair while action still preserves for us a hope that we may stand erect. In other words, the Melians are saying, like, you say that we're going to lose, but war doesn't always turn out the way that you think. And we might end up actually being able to survive. One can imagine for the Melians' sake, I mean, this is an island. There's only a certain amount of troops that the Athenians can have on the island at any given time. Defensiveness means all you have to do is hold out, right? You don't have to defeat the army, you have to outlast them. And so, if you're in a siege position, maybe you're able to actually outlast the Athenians who are trying to knock down the door. We've seen, everybody thought that Russia was going to be able to plow over Ukraine because of the disproportionate number of troops that they possess. Uh, but the Ukrainians, I mean, whether they're winning or losing right now, I'm not sure about the current state of the war itself, but they haven't lost yet. And it's been a few years now. So, Kevin, right now the Melians are bringing up this concept of hope, right? They don't want to be cowed by this coming in of imperial presence. And I think that we see this in Diederkreuz's Declaration of Independence. When faced with these overwhelming odds, he instead decides, no, we are standing up against you. I am putting this question to the people if we should declare independence or not. And to me, given the position that Crossbell is in, that is the ultimate gamble of hope.
You never know what can happen in a war. It's not just numbers. The spirit of the people, the fortunes of war, vague chance can all make superior numbers and training meaningless. There is a very clear connection to, we're going to fight for what's right, and you never know. Good things can happen. And also, the fight itself is worthwhile.
The fight itself is worthwhile. And what's also worthwhile is making sure that we can cover things in full depth and with full energy. We're going to stop this close reading of the Melian Dialogue now, and we can pick this up next week for more hardcore political discussion. You guys knew that we were going to be hovering over this trade conference for as long as we humanly can. I don't know if it'll be an entire month, but it's going to be fucking close. So we will see you next week for more of this close reading of the Melian Dialogue.
See you next time. I'm Kevin. That's Colin. Who's going to win in something that happened well over 2,000 years ago? Stay at the edge of your seat and find out.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye bye.